Their Fated Travels. Chapter 35. The end of the beginning. The beginning of the end. As injuries were healing and money was being spent to sustain the group's stay in Nuln, they realized they wouldn't be able to keep it up for much longer, for they would have to get back and replenish their coin purses with some steady wages from the capital. The group stood around Maestro inside a darkened corner of a Nuln tavern, where they stared at the wizard's latest purchase. He held in his hands a large egg. Tobias inspected it and his eyes narrowed.
Maestro, is that what I think it is?
Maestro uneasily shifted his weight from foot to foot.
Well, probably yes.
Dieter sneered. Oh, good. It looks like there will be enough omelette to go around. Maestro clutched the egg protectively to his chest, replying,
It isn't an egg for eating, Dieter.
Lysandria raised the glasses from the bridge of her nose and rubbed the place where they had left a mark, commenting, Then, if it is not for eating, what is it for? Maestro smiled.
For flying!
Tordrad looked from speaker to speaker, becoming more confused by the moment. Anastasia chipped in.
All right, how can anyone possibly ride an egg?
Dieter looked at the girl with malevolence clear in his eyes. Tobias looked up his nose at the girl, his spectacles catching his eyes in the light and making him look a little like an owl.
Because, dear girl, it will hatch and become a griffin.
Maestro raised a finger to his lips.
Shh! Quiet down about that, then. Do you think I want everyone knowing what I bought on the black market? Especially that Karl Franz. He wouldn't like that, him.
Dieter scratched his head in alarm.
You mean to say, Maestro, that you are proposing to fly that thing when it is fully grown?
Maestro gave an over-exaggerated nod in response and stated,
I just have to make sure that I'm there when it hatches.
Dieter pitched in quickly, so that it will think you are its mother. Maestro screwed his face up at this and defended with,
No, its father, obviously.
Dieter replied with, I like my way more. Lysandria considered this and spoke.
Well, I suppose we should count ourselves lucky, then, that it wasn't a dragon's egg.
Dieter was next to speak. Well, foolish wizard, you should probably keep it away from Tordrad anyway, or before you know it he'll be cracking it into a glass and drinking the damned thing with vodka. As the word vodka was used, Tordrad suddenly became animated and managed to speak Reichsbier enough to say, Drinking? One of Maestro's eyes bugged out as the other screwed up almost impossibly small, as he replied,
Tordrad, it's barely 10 in the morning. What are you thinking?
Tordrad replied with strange words in his native tongue. All heads turned to Anastasia as she translated,
He is thinking that it is 5 hours since his last drink.
Dieter shook his head at how stupid they all were and said, I suppose it would be the best hangover cure, yes, getting drunk again. Then he sighed before continuing, I'm surrounded by idiots. But what is worse is that some of them are the smartest people I know. Tordrad still wanted a drink. He hated having to settle for water, even though it was the right colour. His armour was still being repaired after the massive damage it had sustained these past weeks. Though even without the armour, he still looked overly huge for a human being, like a bear up next to 5 gazelles. Although, for one trying to imagine Tordrad as a bear, one's imagination now would not be called upon to stretch very far. Maestro plucked his spirits up and said,
And consider this, my fine fellows, before adding with consideration, and philowets. The front end of a griffin is an eagle, and the back end is a lion. That works out quite lucky, seeing as I have a bird speak spell. I might be able to communicate with it, at the front end at least. Maybe not the back end, which means it won't be my fault if it goes around pooping on you lot.
Some days later, Tordrad had gone missing without warning. Through a conversation with the other Kislev warrior that took part in the tourney, Tordrad had learned from this man of the whereabouts of the slavers' camp. They were currently pitched 3/4 of a day's ride from Nuln. Tordrad had left to deal with business as he saw it. This gave Dieter no comfort at all. He wondered where the man had gone, but at least he knew Tordrad still lived, for now. After all, the tattoo on his chest was still looking the same, and it wasn't burning yet. Tordrad was without his armour, still in repair at the blacksmith. He wore instead some hardened, heavy leather of a black colour. His swift ride had brought him to the slavers' camp by nightfall. He had dismounted a good distance away from his objective and reconnoitred on foot around the perimeter of the area. He was lightly armoured, and that would make a big difference to how he would approach things, but this also made him lighter on his feet. He was able to dodge and avoid the sentries he found here and there on the outskirts, and climbed a tree that overlooked the area. From this vantage point, he could see where the slaves were being kept, inside pits dug into the ground. These pits had metal grids above the top of them, sealing the areas in at ground level. There were many wide coaches parked in a station area together. It was likely that the slaves were moved via these. Tordrad wondered why they were still here. What purpose were they serving? Then that question was answered. A large white tent illuminated from inside caught the man's eye as the opening flap of it moved, and out stepped several robed men, along with the strange slaver-master wizard who had been present at the tournament. With them appeared several important-looking nobles. These men did not originate from this camp, for they were being shown around, shown the slaves. A procession of helpers walked behind in tow. A snapped neck from behind, and the Kislevite man had made his way into the camp proper. By sticking to the shadows and moving quickly, he managed to get near to the procession of nobles. The robed slaver guard who had been lagging at the back was quickly grabbed with a hand around his mouth and dragged back into darkness. Whatever fate befell him was unseen as at last Tordrad re-emerged again, wearing the man's garb. Now he was in robes, disguised as a guard, albeit an extremely large one. None of the guards were as big as this, but he knew it would help him get away with glances of a merely cursory nature. In the dark of the night, that was all he needed. By patrolling the outer edges of the compound, all the while following the group of nobles who were obviously here to purchase slaves, Tordrad was able to get a good glimpse of the slaves themselves. He could not see the dwarf he had come for. He then remembered the condition he would have been in and realized that he probably would not be shown to potential buyers. The slavers perhaps intended to make him fight in other tournaments at a later date. That could not be allowed to happen. He had made that dwarf a silent vow, though he would not be bound to it, for the recipient hadn't even heard it. Tordrad knew, and that was all there was to it. As the night went on, several slaves had been hand-picked by the nobles and led away. These were purchases that had been secured, a combination of men and women. In one case, a screaming child was taken from his mother, for she was being bought and he was not. Such sights of despair were hard for the northern man to bear, but this firmed his resolve even more. Perhaps he didn't need only to help the dwarf. Tordrad had counted 12 slaves to each pit, always males in one together, with children and females in others separate. He calculated based on how many slaves were shown to the nobles that 2 pits contained slaves that hadn't been shown to the buyers. This was made easier, though, because one of them was a pit for the females. That left only the slave pit on the northwest side of the compound. Tordrad quickly made his way over to it. Being dressed as a guard meant that he could get close enough to examine those inside with quick glances down. He couldn't tell if the dwarf was down there or not, but he had to trust his instinct. He looked over the caged area, but none of those inside took notice of him. He quickly got their attention with, "Psst!" Most of them looked up. When he saw he had an appropriate audience, he began to recite the Reichsspiel words he had learned in advance, spoken in an extremely strained manner. "I am here to rescue you, not leave yet. Leave with Horn." The last word, horn, was particularly hard for him to say, which resulted in his adding several more N's than were needed. Tordrad then surprised the prisoners by producing a key. The guard whose garments Tordrad now wore had been carrying this key on his person. There was only the one key, made of iron. The slavers were indeed lazy or confident in their security, because this one key would therefore likely fit all of the cages. Tordrad began his test of this theory with the first lock. It clicked open quickly. At once the prisoners began to push at it, as if trying to make their exit right now. Tordrad gave these people a stern and threatening look. Even though he was their rescuer, and outnumbered at that, the look in his eyes warned the slaves against disobeying him. There was something fierce there, something more frightening than even the slave master to them. Leaving the cage door unlocked but closed, Tordrad quickly moved on to the next one and did the same, reciting the same words. The key did indeed fit all of the other locks. That was a stroke of luck. Tordrad had learned to take luck for what it was, a helping moment that could be further taken advantage of with immediate sound decisions. He moved on and opened other metal gates in the ground, giving the slaves inside the same message in each case. The bought slaves were now being moved to a separate area near the large white tent the nobles had originally arrived from. The taint of chaos was all about this place. It was more than just simple greed. He had seen this when he'd passed the horses earlier, those tied to the wagons. Their eyes glowed a ghastly red colour. Tordrad had seen this before in creatures tainted by the Chaos Gods. This was a very bad sign indeed, and run by an Empire wizard at that? Terrible, he thought. It appeared that the slavers were going to be leaving soon. Everywhere his eyes darted, he saw tactical opportunity present itself. His plan was now set. Also, nobody seemed to question why the horses had their feed bags attached tonight. They had surely already eaten. Suddenly his plan was in threat of being ruined. One of the guards had moved too close to a slave pit, and a particularly annoyed slave, who couldn't wait for revenge, had lifted the gate, grabbing at the guard's foot and dragging him down into the pit amongst the rabble, where he was set upon by them, with the slaves venting their pent-up aggression. The other guards had been alerted to a disturbance and started to head towards the pit in question. Tordrad adapted to the situation, using it to his advantage, by sneaking directly across the open towards the white tent. Very soon slaves had started to pour out of the pit and were engaging the guards. They had not gone on Tordrad's signal. This at least kept the camp distracted from what he was now doing. He had emptied the gunpowder from several nearby muskets against the tent opening. He then grabbed a nearby torch from a holder stand that was sunk into the ground and threw it at the flap. It ignited quickly, but Tordrad didn't wait around to watch the events that transpired next. The men hurriedly rushed out from the other end of the tent to put the fire out. Another distraction was in place. Nobody blinked twice at an overly large guard running away into the shadows. They might have figured that he was going to fetch a bucket to fill with water or the like. Even though it would have normally been against his better judgment to harm an animal in any way, Tordrad had made an exception for the horses in this place. They were inherently tainted. He could see they were starting to buck and kick, furiously snorting and attacking enemies that weren't there. That was no surprise at all, seeing as Tordrad had earlier come upon a container of the strange madcap mushroom paste the Slaving Corporation had used on Grimdall in the tournament. Tordrad, having acquired this paste, had dropped it into the tainted horses' feed bags and attached them earlier. Now the effects were finally coming about. The restlessness of the steeds intensified by the moment. Tordrad looked about the encampment and saw the other playing pieces set firmly in position. Now was the time, then. A second cage of slaves was already beginning to open from those restless within. The guards saw this too and were forced to split up to deal with it. Frenzied cries were going up everywhere. Tordrad blew his horn, which made a deep sound that reverberated through the chests of all present. This was the signal for the others to emerge. All of the metal gates covering the ground were pushed back at once, and the slaves emerged from every pit together. Of those pits Tordrad had not had the chance to open, the other slaves were going to do it for him, because he had dropped the keys into one of the cages. Now the entire place was truly in ruin. A small army of slaves rebelled against the forces who faced them. Though they outnumbered the guards, they were not armed. They picked up any item they could find to use as improvised weapons. The encampment was in battle all over. The horses broke free of their restraints that tied them to the posts, whinnying and neighing furiously as they broke into homicidal charges for those they first saw, as the madcap compound did its work through their bloodstream. With foaming mouths, they tore into guards, smacking them to the ground and, worse still, pulling the wagons with them. Though these wagons were heavy, their strength was suddenly immense, with the huge containers seeming not to slow them at all. Tordrad pitched into guards here and there, with those falling, dropping their weapons. New opportunities arose for freed slaves to take up arms and fight. Of course, the sounding of the horn had not really been for the slaves' sakes. It had only been tied into what Tordrad was already going to do, so the two could easily happen together. The horn was a cue for avalanche. The Kislev hailed Warhorse to charge into the encampment, and that is exactly what the glorious beast did, its hooves thundering hard against the ground as it picked up on the excitement in the air all around it. With one motion, Tordrad jumped onto the beast as it kept charging through with no pulls. Both were confident and well rehearsed in such manoeuvres together by now. Tordrad single-handedly stampeded through a group of guards, cutting down the stragglers to the sides. This gave the ailing slaves nearby new hope. He searched around for his target, the dwarf. He was still nowhere to be seen. No matter, he decided, and continued onwards. He rode quickly, towards and then into the rampaging lines of tainted steeds that still pulled the wagons, even though they were sustaining damage at a great rate. As Tordrad ducked and weaved amongst them, following their flow of gallop, he was protected from the row of archers who were attempting to sight him up. Their lines of vision were blurred and uncertain. The command came to shoot the other horses anyway. The guards complied. As one horse fell, its wagon overturned and crashed through a tent. Tordrad had already made it around the edge of the camp again and began to gallop in a line behind the archers, towards a row of 3 small cannons along the ground. These cannons Tordrad had come upon earlier in his reconnaissance. He had made sure they were loaded with ammunition and powder. He had also made sure to turn them around to face the camp. Tordrad rode on and brought Avalanche to a stop momentarily in front of another of those large torches on a stick in the ground. He removed it and held it up into the air, speaking calming words to the horse and patting it to make sure it did not fear the fire. It trusted its rider's soothing words, and it did not act in an unruly fashion. He rode on, back the way he had come from, back towards the cannons. The archers were now causing disruption in the slaves. While their aggression was high, their morale was waning from the arrow fire that landed amongst them. Just at that moment, Tordrad had reached the cannons, and as he sped past them, he lowered the blazing torch from horseback, catching alight all 3 fuses in succession. He rode on, and by the time he had began to steer around to gallop towards the centre again, the cannons fired. Chaos and disruption was everywhere. The archers had lost half of their number from a cannon ball hitting the middle of their line. The other balls had shot across the encampment, tearing the earth up around it. This gave the impression that they were being attacked by an army from the outside, further adding to the state of panic and confusion everywhere. Finally, Tordrad spotted Grimdal. He was fighting a group of guards as best he could. His injuries did indeed still look severe, but he fought with a passion that was unbridled, and took his foes by surprise. Tordrad rode in and cut down the men who were upon him. He then spoke. "Get on, horse!" Of course, Grimdal couldn't understand him, saying,
"You think I can understand that muddling jumble you're speaking, manling? Guess again. Wait a minute."
As he said this, his demeanour changed.
"I know you. You're that bastard I fought in the arena."
Tordrad nodded his head enthusiastically at this and started with a strained attempt at Reichspiel. "I do save," as he pointed at Grimdal. The dwarf clenched his teeth.
"I don't need saving, but you're going to. I haven't forgotten it. You are part of it. That's all I know."
With that, Grimdal charged Tordrad, even though he was on horseback. It was suicide. Tordrad couldn't let it go that way, though, after trying so hard to rescue him. He gave a command to Avalanche in his native tongue, and the horse reared up, kicking the dwarf to the head with its front hooves. Tordrad jumped down from Avalanche, picking up the now unconscious form of the dwarf, and rested him on his front across the back of the horse. He was about to climb up onto his mount when he was interrupted by a clearing of the throat behind him. He turned around slowly and was confronted by the cowled figure of the wizard, he who had led this band of slavers. The wizard too recognized Tordrad. He had seen him against his dwarf fighter, the same one now across the back of the horse. The slaver wizard spoke.
"I see you could not let it go, man of the north. That is a terrible shame. Now you come to my place of work and cause disruption. You are the cause of this, aren't you?"
Tordrad simply stared at the man, unable to understand his words anyway. The wizard continued.
"Did you think I would just let you get away with it? I am a magister of great power. It is a shame that you are not wearing that beautiful metal armor you had on when I last saw you. I could have encased you in it like an Iron Maiden. I suppose I will have to think of some other creative thing to do to you."
The wizard brought his staff up and pointed it at Tordrad. The large man jumped out of the way as a huge blast of energy poured forth from it, barely missing him. Tordrad landed with a roll and drew his scimitar and shield. The wizard threw a single gun bullet at the shield. It sped at it unnaturally, and as it touched the metal of the surface, bore straight through it as if it were warm dough. The bullet came through the shield and impacted into Tordrad's side. Blood began to drip from his wound. Tordrad threw the shield at the wizard, but before it could reach, it turned to liquid metal and fell harmlessly to the floor around him in metallic droplets. Tordrad stared in shock and looked worriedly to his own blade suddenly. The wizard smiled.
"Yes, that's right."
And as he unleashed another spell, this time on Tordrad's scimitar, the weapon began to melt as he held it. A great burning pain seared Tordrad's hand as he was forced to drop it, lest the metal bond itself to his skin. Tordrad began to run forwards. He was determined to kill the wizard with his bare hands if he had to. The liquid metal droplets on the ground suddenly rose into the air and hovered for a moment. Tordrad quickly drew his great axe, and just in time, with a gesture from the wizard, the droplets fired towards Tordrad. He turned side on and raised the flat of his axe against them defensively. Only one droplet got past the axe, and it burned the ground nearby. The rest stuck to the weapon. This was bad too, for they started to work their way through the axe itself, making it steam from the melting contact. He finally reached the wizard and swung his axe at him with all of his strength. He knew he only had time to get one good swing in before this weapon too was rendered useless. The wizard's body, though, instantly became covered in a metal coating as the axe blade sparked off of it, making an impression but not penetrating the metallic skin. Tordrad was forced to drop the axe before it too was used against him. He now had no choice in the matter. He gave his battle cry, "Dotor!" and punched the wizard with his fists. Each impact clanged against the metal, but did not injure or faze the man at all, merely rocking him back a step here and there. The wizard took great pleasure in watching the man just tiring out on him. Just at that moment, something strange began to happen. Tordrad's eyes began to crackle with energy like they had done several times before. Lightning suddenly surged through him, crackling down his arms, and at that moment, as his fist made contact with the wizard, an electrical current from him passed into the metal and through to the man behind it. The wizard was electrocuted from the charge. With each fist that struck, the electrocution continued. The metal covering the wizard quickly receded back, and another well-placed fist smacked the man to the ground. He lay there convulsing painfully and then went still. He looked dead. His body was steaming from the electrical heat that had poured into it. With a satisfied battle cry, Tordrad mounted up and raced hard for the nearest exit. There was no gate in place, only a group of guards across it. He ran avalanche right through them, knocking them aside. The slaves saw this and took advantage of the breach at once. A massive revolt had taken place, and soon the camp had been overthrown. Those slaves who had survived the ordeal managed to escape and headed to Nuln for help. Tordrad quickly rode ahead of them with the now freed dwarf. Once they reached the city, Tordrad had delivered Grimdal to Rysandria for treatment. She took him willingly, and though he was violent and angry when he came to, he did not raise a hand to the woman directly. Tordrad felt it was better if he wasn't around anymore, or ever met him again for that matter, because the dwarf might not easily understand the truth of his intentions, not until he had time to think upon events and calm his mind. That certainly wasn't going to be any time soon after waking. Rysandria did what she could for the dwarf, seeing his chemical low caused by his body's now dependence on madcap mushrooms. She began treatment at once. He would always have a slight, drawing need for the evil substance. That could not be changed. But the actual physical dependence on it could. He would just have to go cold turkey, locked up in confinement. Nothing she did, though, would ever heal the mental scars of the dwarf, regardless of how much she mended his physical condition. Dwarfs were just that way inclined. In fact, as the days rolled on, and Grimdal rolled around in his new prison as he saw it, sweating and wanting to die, he swore something out loud. Of all of the many words he did swear, of this one thing he spoke only once. Only once did such a thing need to be said. He swore to Grimnir that this atrocity for a life would be rectified. He swore to shave his head and undertake the oath of the Slayer. Only then would his afterlife be one of contentment and peace. Only then would he sit in the halls of his ancestors and drink of their ale. He resolved, as soon as he was well enough over these effects, he would escape this place and make his way to Karak Kadrin, the Slayer Keep, to the shrine of Grimnir. Upon arrival, he would offer up his shaven hair in prayer to the ancestor god. Soon, he thought. Soon.